Hi, I'm Jeff Ranke, Editorial Director of Manufacturing.net and Manufacturing Business Technology. Welcome to Security Breach. So, as you guys know, I love looking through industry reports and finding all those stats supporting the theme or message of each episode. But in this instance, I'm simply going to recap what continues to be the industrial sector's biggest threat: ransomware. We started 2023 on the right track. The frequency of these attacks was down, although the amount being extorted continued to creep upwards. Manufacturing also held on to its position as the most highly targeted sector, with the most frequent victims generating between $10 and $60 million in annual revenues. As time progressed, however, those early decreases turned into a spike of around 70% when comparing the frequency of ransomware attacks between the first and second quarters of the year, and it continued to rise through the third and fourth quarters of 2023. It's my belief that a number of factors contributed to the temporary lull in attacks that preceded the tidal wave of extortion activity that followed. First, the very nature of dwelling attacks would indicate that hackers might lay low in the ICS for 4 to 6 months before launching a repeat attack. Certain global events were also capturing the attention of many Russian-based ransomware groups and diverted their resources elsewhere. However, I also believe that a combination of heightened awareness, additional security investments, and an influx of cybersecurity tools helped elevate the defensive posture of the U.S. industrial sector in warding off many potential exploits. Unfortunately, the cruel reality is that the bad guys, supported in many cases by easier access to advanced AI platforms, did what most predators do over time. They continued to hunt, and they evolved. This evolution allows hackers to constantly adjust to new security protocols and more rapidly react to common vulnerabilities, often days, weeks, or months before a suitable patch or solution can be put in place. It's the Black Hat's constant drive to enhance their attacks that leads us to today's discussion and guest. It's my pleasure to welcome Rick Kaun, VP of Solutions at Verve Industrial Protection, to the show. Verve is a leading provider of endpoint security, vulnerability testing, and network segmentation strategies. Rick, thanks so much for joining us today, and welcome to Security Breach. So, Rick, thanks so much for joining us, and welcome to Security Breach.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. I love the work you guys are doing, and looking forward to contributing to the body of knowledge you're sharing with a growing market and an expanding need. So happy to be a part of it.
Absolutely awesome. Well, hey, I know one of the things that Verve does is they do a lot of vulnerability testing. We know in the industrial sector, the ICS is leading to a lot more expansion. We've got more devices coming on board. We've got all this wonderful Industry 4.0 technology. So what are you guys seeing as you're doing more of this vulnerability testing? Are there some trends or some areas that you're seeing more things sort of pop up?
Yeah, so just as background, I've been in this industry for 22, 23 years, and it's surprising on the one hand that, I say the same things I've been saying for 20 years, and people still like, oh, hey, I better write that down, right? Which is great, in terms of job security. But what I am seeing is that people are realizing that we can't just do the cursory effort anymore, right? I mean, I've been in this long enough to know there's two different silver bullets that tried to come through. The first is whitelisting in about 2009. The last 5 or 6 years have been this network analysis. I can sit on the perimeter and listen and tell you enough. And I think people are realizing that, no, the real risk and the technical debt we've inherited as they truly evolve into Industry 4.0 and digital transformation is there's a lot of legacy debt, and to get to it and to be able to truly understand vulnerability and risk, I need to actually get down into it and understand its context in the environment as well. It's a three-dimensional data ask as opposed to a cursory sort of swipe at understanding. It's an interesting evolution to watch, for sure.
So where do most manufacturers, where should they be starting? I think a lot of people in the audience, they're either not sure where to start, or they're further along and they're trying to shore up a lot of these sort of soft spots along the way. What advice would you give to manufacturers when they look at the attack surface, when they look at their ICS? What's some of that low-hanging fruit you think they need to hit, or what's the next step beyond that?
Yeah, I think there's three things that I'd want to jump in on that one. The first is a lot of people, and this is sort of a precursor, if you haven't already for the midstream, or if you just don't know, what does done look like? What are we trying to do, right? You can't boil the ocean. We're never going to be everything's Windows 11 and you patch on Tuesday. So what's good enough, right? Which begets the second question or the second thing I wanted to share was, well, what is it we're trying to protect? And so inventory is a key contributor. It will make or break whatever you do. So make sure you're solid on your inventory. But then, as I alluded to in the first answer, it's not just an IP list of addresses or an IP list of relative to vulnerabilities. It's about context, because again, we had a client the other day, 23,000 vulnerabilities in their flagship facility. That's useless. They're never going to get to zero, and you're never going to start at the top of the list. However, if I can go and say unequivocally, I've got this many devices, and not just OS based, but network and embedded in PLCs, and these are the ones that are critical to safe operations or to safety or product spec or what have you. And then I can start to have a contextual discussion around, well, it's a critical system with a critical vulnerability. But in my investments for backup and network segmentation and secure remote access, I can probably, negate that score to a degree or at least live with it for a period of time. And now we're dealing with fact and context as opposed to hyperbole and big red X's on the board and FUD, as I like to call it. If you start with, I know what I actually truly have, I can provide context to it, and this is where I'm trying to get to. Now we've got a manageable list of things to do and how big that task is.
You bring up a really interesting sort of talking point there, because I think internally the conversation has shifted from cybersecurity, yeah, we'll deal with that when we get to it, to, okay, we need to deal with it. Where do we start? How do I get funding for a lot of these things? And I think where it comes down to that CISO or some of the some of the OT folks, that recognizing the issues and trying to get funding. But when they go higher up the food chain to try to get those financial resources, it's difficult to validate, because essentially you're trying to make sure something doesn't happen. So what type of advice or feedback or best practices could you offer in sort of helping those cybersecurity champions demonstrate the need for something that hopefully you never realize you have?
Yeah, no, and that's you hit upon the quintessential challenge of risk versus impact, right? Or risk being impact versus likelihood. And if I don't know that I've had an event, or I don't know what the likelihood is, how can I really quantify it? You ask any operator what an hour of downtime costs, and it's pretty straightforward. You ask anyone in the front office at the C-level, CFO, CIO, what brand reputation costs, and it's also pretty significant. And when you turn around and say, I think Clorox's estimated outage was $5 billion. That's, you could build 100 programs under that $5 billion thing. So there has to be a certain, at least, open-mindedness or tolerance to it, and understanding that we're trying to protect the brand, we're trying to protect what makes us the money. But then once you get into that, because it is a program, it is a very different value prop or business case than simply, if you buy me this additional piece of equipment, I can cut down process time or add 50% to the stock feed and how far it goes, et cetera. You need to build a program, and that program has to go back to what we said before. What does done look like? We're not trying to boil the ocean. We're going to put data in front of you. You can decide as a leader of the organization. We're trending away from being good because more threats are coming out, as you identified in the introduction. Let's add more people, or let's add more technology, or we can live with it because we're going to do compensating controls. It all stems from building the story around a whole program, but there has to be at least a somewhat receptive audience to hear it in the first place.
Yeah. The unfortunate reality is that as we hear more about more and more attacks, you mentioned Clorox, there's been things with Boeing that have come out, there's been a number of high-profile attacks that seems to be helping to loosen the purse strings. You just wish it wasn't taking those types of sort of catastrophic events.
The fastest check writing we saw was a client who was hemming and hawing, and we're trying to get in, and suddenly they got hit and hit CNN, and next thing you know, the checks were flowing, and we couldn't move people fast enough. It's a fun story to tell, jokingly, now that we've got the crown jewels under protection in a better space, but it's horrible that sometimes it takes that level of impetus to act.
Yeah. Rick, just kind of hitting on all of the experience that you have in cybersecurity, especially in the industrial sector, I'm kind of curious, where do you see the most evolution happening? We know in the last, I would say, in my opinion, probably 2 to 3 years, the industrial sector has done a lot in playing catch up. They kind of had to. Coming out of the pandemic, they realized a lot of their shortcomings on the cyber end of it. Certainly Colonial Pipeline helped open a lot of eyes there. Are the bad guys still moving too fast for us to catch up, or who is kind of moving faster at this point? Is it the good guys, the bad guys? What are you seeing going on there, and what are some of the biggest tools sort of pushing some of that evolution?
I think what you've identified, the general awareness, and I think it's being pushed in various organizations, a number of fronts. Some it's because insurance has come along and said we're increasing premiums and decreasing coverage. In others, it's been pending regulation. We see a lot happening in Europe at the moment. In others, it's nobody wants to be a CISO. I think what's the lifespan of a CISO now? About 12 to 14 months. Yeah. I think that people are just getting it better, and so I think that because of that, we're getting people that are sort of breaking down the barriers I think that as we evolve into this space, more and more people are getting religion, if you will. They're wanting to, whether it's insurance company, whether it's regulation, whether it's brand awareness, or whether it's, nobody wants to be a CISO anymore, because they only last 12, 14 months. They're getting the idea. And what they're doing is they're going back to the drawing board. And for the most part, the most enlightening thing I think I've seen so far is a willingness to listen and a willingness to examine and maybe throw out the traditional playbook. Some of the biggest barriers to success we've ever had as an OT space is, well, this is OT and that's IT, and I don't want IT tools. You don't understand OT. We don't have people to support it. I don't get it. It doesn't help me make more product. And so, my favorite one, the vendor won't let it, because they have to take care of things. Well, I mean, we should all be in this together. And if we were to stop and put that all aside and say practically and technically, what's the best path forward, we'd come up with some pretty cool solutions pretty quickly. And so I start to see on the good guy side that, there's the barriers are starting to fall, the collaboration is starting to increase. There are still pockets of resistance. Bad guys are always going to evolve. And I think I think the good and the bad thing is, and this is horrible to say, but in my neighborhood, if I've got, cameras visible and signs up for my security system, they're not even going to case my house. They're going to go to the next one. And that's not great to hope your neighbor's in trouble. But you know what I'm saying is you're showing a higher profile and therefore less likelihood and you're a less desirable target. The bad guys are going to go to wherever's the easiest, to be honest.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, we started out kind of talking about, and you've mentioned it a couple of times, we're not trying to boil the ocean here. We know there's always going to be vulnerabilities out there, especially as the attack surface expands. That's just the nature of the ICS right now. But are there any particular tactics or groups out there that are sort of lighting up your radar that are maybe saying to you, hey, these guys are doing this. This is something we can learn from, or this is becoming more prominent. Put this one higher on the priority list. Anything like that sort of catching your attention more right now?
Not explicitly. I mean, the single biggest weakness at any organization is never tech. It's the people and the process and the adoption and the application of the security controls. So until we have locked down people and phishing and all those other campaigns, it's never going to be perfect. I think that more and more organizations are getting that they can't be bulletproof and that they have to have stop and restore and get back to normal. And we're getting better at that. But in general, I don't really see, to be honest, a specific avenue or technique necessarily. I mean, you could read the emerging journals and look at the it's 2024, so I'm sure all the 2023 year in reviews are going to come out and see what the most common attack vector was. But at the end of the day, nobody's bulletproof. It's how quickly do you detect and how quickly do you get back to normal. So it's a good maturation process. But I do see some benefits in things like the EPSS tool, which is now somebody going and saying, let's put a mathematical score on how often these, of all the different exploits and vulnerabilities out there, which ones are most being exploited. And maybe you want to, elevate those. So we are trying to draw back in a feedback loop from what's happening in the market. But those always change as well, right? What's on the EPSS score today is going to be different in a month. So, and we're actually trying to incorporate that into our analysis. So, here's your asset, here's its criticality, here's its vulnerabilities. And by the way, these ones are being exploited. So of that whole 23,000, let's get you down your subset, your low hanging fruit. So we're evolving. But it changes every week or month, to be honest.
Yeah. You mentioned detection and response, which is part of any cybersecurity plan, but that response part has been something that I think manufacturers have really struggled with. Understanding or putting together sort of a roadmap on how to react once you realize you've been hit, whether it's getting the ransomware note or doing it on your own. Maybe looking over the past 5 years, have there been any trends or certain things that you've seen that manufacturers are doing better, or an area that they're starting to focus on when it comes to that response portion of their plan?
Yeah, and I think that one's sort of an interesting, almost a red herring sort of thing. You look at manufacturing, you look at the reported statistics of cyber incidents in OT, and the incidents don't seem huge. They don't seem massive, and I think that's twofold. Number one, there's no impetus to report, and it's maybe embarrassing. Yeah. But the second is that in OT, something starts to go wonky, they nuke it, start it from scratch, build from bare metal, and get back at it. So they're far ahead of IT in terms of response or recovery, at least from a bare operational perspective. And I think that many times cyber incidents or cyber events get swept out if they're caught in time on that OT side, because they simply go back to status quo and back to normal. Now, I am seeing real leaders in the market. Unfortunately, the exception of the rule. A good friend of mine actually is head of health and safety for a massive oil company here in Calgary. They're actually doing a cyber exercise sometime in the next month or two where there's going to be a pen tester, and if he gets in, they're going to send an email and it's going to be a ransomware. They're going to practice scrambling the team and setting up the wire and preparing to send the money, and what their negotiated threshold is going to be, et cetera. That is worlds ahead, unfortunately, of 80% of the people I talk to.
Wow. Yeah. No, it's interesting. You bring up the one part of that dynamic, which is how many of these incidents really go reported. We hear about the big ones because they have to talk about those things in quarterly calls or whatever the case may be. But there's a lot of privately held manufacturers that we never hear about that are getting hit pretty regularly. So it'll be interesting to see how that dynamic evolves as well. That's one area we've seen the hackers sort of change their tactics as well, and going after a lot of these smaller folks that play a huge part in the supply chain. So,
there's an auto parts manufacturer I talked to. They're lucky to make 6% margin because it's pure volume. And if they ever go down, even if the highway into their factory gets an accident on it, they potentially go out of spec, right? So yeah, those are high stakes, small margin, and they get bled pretty quickly. Those organizations.
Yeah, and in that situation, they're not feeling pressure just from an operational perspective, but from all their partners who are going to go someplace else if they don't get back up and running. It's a lot of interesting dynamics in manufacturing. So, Rick, we've talked about a lot of different stuff. Tell us a little bit more about Verve and what you guys are up to and what you do to help support the industrial cybersecurity efforts.
Yeah, so Verve I'm actually quite excited to be a part of, not just because, they pay my check and it heats the house in this freezing Canadian tundra that I'm in. But like I said, I've been in this about 23 years, and I had always wanted the company I used to work for, Matron, to build me something like what Verve does. And then Honeywell sort of took it on, but a little harder to steer the Titanic over there. And so when I got a chance to join Verve, which was doing what I think is a difference, and it goes to what we spoke about earlier, people are just saying, look, forget the territorial and the politics and whatever, what technically makes sense. And Verve actually grew as a company 30 years ago as systems engineers, as automation engineers. So we do DCS programming, PLC upgrades, et cetera. And then when NERC started to emerge at the front end of some of these push to bring IT and security regulation into it, we built the Verve Security Center platform. And we actually are an endpoint management platform built by OT for OT. And what we want to do is we want to go to those endpoints, get all the data, get the context, present it to you so have, again, that informed decision to then be able to go and react and to say, look, as an organization, 23,000 vulnerabilities isn't enough. But if I only had 3,000, and they were all low impact on stuff that was way down the Purdue model and had redundancies built in and good backups, I can sleep at night. We're helping clients go from noise and uncertainty and where do I start and how far do I go and which do I prioritize? And we're helping them do that. The exciting part about that is because of our success. I mean, when I started, we were, a dozen, power clients, mostly in North America. Today, we're in 1,100 operating facilities worldwide in 80 countries, multiple industry verticals. We got the attention of a real big heavyweight in the form of Rockwell. So we just got acquired. And Rockwell is even more exciting. It takes my excitement of originally starting with Verve and saying, okay, great. Now let's do this globally in some of the largest supply chain organizations, consumer packaged goods, wastewater, utilities, et cetera, oil and gas, whatever, critical infrastructure to, nice to haves to need to haves, et cetera. But to flex the muscle of that development team and the delivery capabilities, we talk about, SOCs and their incident response and whatever. Small company, we can't do that, but Rockwell has it. And so now I can go to my mom and pop manufacturers, like you were saying, and say, look, you don't have to stand up a whole team. We got your back. Use the Verve software. We'll send it up to reporting console. We can keep an eye on it for you. So we're helping to evolve those people to make it less cost prohibitive, to make it less resource prohibitive. Nobody has an army to do this. I'm really quite excited what the future looks like, not only for Verve, but Verve within the Rockwell portfolio as well.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you brought up there, too. I think what you're really offering in a lot of senses is a place to start. I think that's where people get really, really just overwhelmed. And when you talk about endpoint security and getting that inventory and understanding what you've got to deal with, it just gives you a place to dig in and get going. So that sounds very encouraging.
It is. It's quite exciting. And the aha moment when you show somebody, they go, oh, look at this. Look what I can do with it. Yeah. And then they come and they want to tell other people. We had a CISO of a chemical company phone our CEO just last week and said, I know I've told you this before, but your people are amazing. And if you need me to talk to anybody, either about your product or your company, you just let me know I'm your guy. Which you can't buy that sort of endorsement, right? And this is one of those CISOs that has a short shelf life, but is now able to show his board exactly where they are, multiple facilities globally, exactly what DCOM means when it comes out, right? And that's the difference.
Absolutely. So I want to throw a couple of hot topics at you, Rick, here, kind of, again, lean on your experience again. You mentioned being a CISO right now, especially in an industrial organization, pretty challenging, and you're talking about burnout a little bit. I would think one of the reasons for that is it's very difficult to find the right talent to help embed within an organization to support a lot of these efforts. So when you look at this growing need we have for OT security specialists, where can we go? What have you seen successful organizations do in sort of addressing that challenge? Is it going outside, developing people within, or what have you seen?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's no single silver bullet for that one. It's going to have to come from multiple places. There are organizations. One of the things I learned about Rockwell is that they actually take Army vets and they retrain them to be system integrators and instrumentation techs, right? And then allow them to go back and work in that industry, which is starving for people. So there are some initiatives in the market. I know a number of schools like the ones I've gone to and ones that I also support are building specific courses for industrial cybersecurity. So taking security and putting that niche sort of thing on top of it, which again is great. There's not enough people going to it. It's not the sexiest thing in the world, right? We have a client that worked for a massive power company and they're in the woodlands in Texas. Isn't this nice? And they get there and they do some mind-numbing, online research for 8 hours a day, and it's kind of tough to keep them. So what I think is happening though is many organizations are starting to build that. This is sort of, instead of a silo of a couple of OT guys maybe doing their own thing, or an IT guy that sort of gets thrown over the fence and has to go make nice with them, they're actually incorporating the overall security portfolio for the org, IT and OT, and they're able to build a career path. Right, we're doing that even within Rockwell. Right, you come in at the front end, you learn the basics, you help to position things, you then start to help with maybe some of the architectural, maybe some of the deployment stuff, et cetera. Then work for what we call our customer success team. We actually dial in with the user and the software, and you say, what are you doing today? Is it regulatory that you're reporting? Is it planning? Is it what have you, measuring the gap, et cetera? And so you can evolve people either within your vendors, within your own organization, or out through the educational institutions, and start to bring them in. But it is going to have to be homegrown. There's just not enough bodies to do it. And we need to, when we go and hire some new, well-equipped, capable person, we can't have them toiling away at something mundane for too terribly long. They need to learn the basics and move on. We need to be able to show that there's a career path. And there's what is it, over 1 million unfulfilled cyber jobs? Like, I mean, if you can bring someone in and you're in an organization such that you can teach them, whether you're on the operator side or the vendor side, and you have sort of a roadmap, we will start to build that future generation. Now, in addition to that, back to the what Verve is doing, what we're trying to do, one of the things we built ours on is, if we break down the barriers of what we did before and what we want to try and do in the future, you can use tools like ours, which we call Think Global, Act Local. We're actually able to reduce the manpower required to respond to a particular emerging event like DCOM by almost 70%. So traditional method would take you 100 hours. With this methodology, it would take you 30. There are evolutions in product, process, technology, vendor support, managed services as well. So multiple fronts for clients, depending where you're at in the maturity level, what your spend appetite is. A lot of people like to do it in-house. A lot of people like to sign a check and have somebody take care of it for them. There are options, but it's going to take time.
Yeah. You mentioned the 1 million open cyber jobs right now. I have a feeling that's going to go up exponentially because right now there's a lot of companies, especially in manufacturing, they don't even realize they need this person right now. But once they do, those job openings are going to increase. And just to kind of reinforce, too, what you said about taking advantage of veterans in our military experience, look at Israel and look at how many cybersecurity firms have evolved there. And I would say a very high percentage of those are ex-military as well. So it's definitely a great group to tap into.
Yep. Yeah, there's some good creative things. And you're absolutely right. That is 100% former military. I mean, half of our customer success team is former NSA. Yeah. People have great, solid electronic training. They want to come and apply it to the critical infrastructure and supporting, organizations. So it's fun.
Absolutely. So I'll throw another one at you here. One of the things that we're hearing about is a lot more automation companies. I mean, you guys work with Rockwell. They're coming out with patches. They are finding these vulnerabilities, hopefully before they become 0 days, getting out patches. But for a manufacturer, that's a challenge. I mean, it seems like a patch is a solution, but they got to shut stuff down and figure out how to implement that patch. What have you seen, or what are your thoughts there in sort of managing that dynamic? Is it just about establishing priorities? Is it sort of getting back to that don't boil the ocean dynamic, or what's a potential solution there?
The two best things you can do in that space is, again, understanding context, right? And the second is the ability to pivot into if-then or compensating controls. And I'll give you an example of a client of ours that did that because it's leveraging exactly the infrastructure I just told you about that takes 100 hours down to 30. DCOM came out, and I won't name the name of the vendor, but the DCOM came out and their particular vendor said that they do not support that patch, at least not yet. Well, they're trying to figure it out. I get it. I work for a manufacturer now, used to work for a manufacturer before. Sometimes it takes some time, but they didn't want to live with the risk. So what they did was they looked at that global dashboard, which showed 5 different lithium mines globally, all the way from the jungles of Argentina to Florida to somewhere in Europe, et cetera. And one guy in Sarasota having to be responsible to support all of these, right? So small headcount. And what he was able to do was able to look at the dashboard and see how many of his devices were in scope for decom. And then he looked at the contextual risk to say, well, only 3 of these are critical systems, safety systems or production line, et cetera. But 3 or 4 of them aren't. I have 7 in total, whatever. But I can't do anything about it because the vendor didn't approve the patch. So what he did was he then said, well, let's look at the release notes. And he pulled in his pure security guy. So IT and OT working together. The pure security guy had to help read through the release notes and figured out that the only change on that particular patch was 2 different registry edits. And so our guy picked a couple of those redundant systems that were low impact, and he tried editing the registry with our software remotely. He could do it on the side of the hill in the jungle in Borneo or whatever. And it came back and it seemed to be fine. He let it bake in for 3 days. Everything was cool. And then he decided to automate. So one guy took care of 7 different risks at 5 different plants globally without actually following the vendor's patch approval. And he did it in order of criteria of the asset to operations. So context was in there, compensating controls were in there, IT/OT convergence was in there, and an element of automation was in there. And now we have a guy fixing a problem on behalf of his whole organization where the vendor couldn't quite support it yet, but without having to go to the boss and say, too bad, so sad, we just got to live with it. Yeah. That's to me what the next generation is going to be.
Interesting. So, kind of wrapping things up here, Rick, we've talked about a lot of stuff, but I'd like to get your feel for some of the trends that might be coming down the road. And one in particular I have to ask you about, and you're probably sick of even talking about it at this point, but we got to mention artificial intelligence. We got to talk about AI a little bit. So what are some of your thoughts there, general trends, as well as maybe the role of AI as we get into the new year?
I would like to use it where I think it makes the most sense. So when we talk about a risk register, we bring in as much data as we can from the asset itself, from tribal knowledge from the operators as to asset criticality, like the example I just gave you, or what its physical location is. And then, third-party data around vulnerabilities, about exploit scores, like we said, we're starting to incorporate, et cetera. And I'd like AI to take a run at helping to calculate that and add more data layers to it to get a more nuanced thing. I think that's fantastic. I think that there is also a very real risk in allowing AI to be your first or only or last line of defense. I mean, we often talk about, OT, well-intentioned OT, but swiping at the surface and saying, well, let's just do a perimeter detection and a network intrusion detection tool. That should be good enough. Well, if you told that as a CISO on the IT side that you're going to use one tool to protect the whole enterprise and all the crown jewels, you'd be even quicker. You'd be bringing that average CISO tenure down. So I think AI has a role if we use it appropriately, but I think that its promise and its delivery has been overhyped. And I think it's going to take a while before we really truly find value out of it. I had thought you were going to say SBOMs, but I have a different opinion on that one.
Well, hey, I mean, it was pretty open-ended, if that's another, what do you got to say about those?
I think so. I think SBOMs are an important next step. So if I back up to when network intrusion detection and people telling CISOs that they could just listen to packets and tell them everything they need to know, that they were trying to play to a fear and it was oversold. And I don't think they were ready for true network intrusion detection and Star Wars type of connections between devices and seeing packets zipping back and forth when they don't even know what their inventory is. I think SBOM is in the same category. I think SBOM is going to go out and find 20,000 more vulnerabilities from my gas client I just told you about, over and above the 20,000 that are in the higher level OS in the application. And I think eventually we need to get there. But when you talk about low-hanging fruit, I go to a facility, we put in our technology, I can see 5 computers, all of them running a second network card and 4 of them running a homemade team viewer to bypass their remote access. That is a way bigger issue. 47 dormant administrative accounts, all belonging to departed employees. World of Warcraft running on a spare HMI. We have so many bigger problems than future state line-by-line code analysis of SBOMs down the road. I understand the value. I think it's great. They're getting ahead of it. When the time comes, it will be widely adopted. I just think it's a little bit ahead of its time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's crazy. You bring up those admin accounts or those inactive accounts. I mean, this goes back to Colonial Pipeline. That should have been one of the biggest takeaways from these huge hacks, is that they were using these outdated accounts and stealing passwords through phishing schemes, all that kind of stuff. So it's crazy that some of that stuff still exists, and it's not at small companies. It's at a lot of the larger manufacturers as well.
I work with some really talented cyber people at super majors, and what they have as a corporate policy and expectation versus what is actually in an operating facility is where the challenge is. And you're absolutely correct. You would be shocked at how many times people want to install Excel, for example, to look at ladder logic and a rebuild. Remember those restore that we talked
Yeah.
about? Build for metal, something went wrong. Throw it on there, grab the CD. Well, unless they turn off, you know, Access and PowerPoint and Word, they're getting all those other things and all the vulnerabilities that go with them. And nobody knows they're there because nobody accesses them, but a virus does, because it'll go find that particular file or that share or that port and it'll light it up. And then next thing you know, it's too late, right? And so if there's nothing else I can impart to the viewership on this one, or the listenership on this one, is you need to get your base data correct and you need to go to the device to get it. If you don't go to the source and see what is on it or not on it, those dormant accounts are exploitable components that aren't transmitting anywhere. They're not aware to anyone of any sort of thing or change in baseline, but those are land and expand opportunities for should something get into that environment.
Absolutely. Rick, this has been tremendous. Really appreciate the time and the insight. Any closing thoughts you'd like to offer before we sign off?
I just want to, put a plug for the fact that I think this is one of the fastest growing opportunities. And if you are a younger person or you have people that are younger kids, I couldn't, be more emphatic in wanting to get into these places and try and help. But there's going to be a long and varied opportunity for you. I appreciate venues like this that you guys have to get the word out there, because like I said, I feel like I've been saying the same thing for 20 years and people are like, oh, hey, that's not a bad idea. So obviously more work needs to be done. And so as long as we work together in tackling these big problems, like where we can find the next generation, how do we get ahead of it? How do we figure out what does done look like, and how do we share and learn lessons from each other? That's where we're going to start to really move the needle. I hate for regulation to come in, or that example I gave earlier, where the fastest check we ever wrote was somebody who got exploited. We don't want people to be in that boat. We'd rather be getting there under our own circumstances and our own time frame. But to do that, we got to start having hard discussions and doing the sleeve rolling up and going right to the endpoint and fixing this legacy debt that we've inherited over 10 and 15 years of putting in technology without worrying about security.
Thanks, Rick. And for more information on the work he and his colleagues are doing, you can check him out at verveindustrial.com. Thank you for joining us today. And to catch up on past episodes, you can go to manufacturing.net, IN.com, or mbtmag.com. You can also check Security Breach out wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Amazon, and Overcast. And if you have a cybersecurity story or topic that you'd like to have us explore in Security Breach, you can reach me at jeff@in.com. For Rick Kaun, I'm Jeff Ranke, and this is Security Breach.